Welcome to the Inventory Professional Podcast, brought to you by InventoryBase, providers of industry-leading property inspection software, accredited training, and on-demand property reports. Join us as we discuss the latest news, legislation, and all things property, hosted by our very own inventory expert, Sián Metcalfe. With regular special guests, listen in to our open and honest discussions about the role of the inventory professional and how to navigate through this ever-changing, fast-paced industry.
Welcome to the Inventory Professional. I'm Sián Metcalfe from InventoryBase Academy, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by Matthew Hooker, who's the co-founder of Ome, but also with a Hamilton Fraser hat as well, Matthew.
Thank you for inviting me.
No, I'm really pleased that you could come. I'm great. I'm really good, thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, keeping busy.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think it's certainly starting to get busier now, isn't it? Now that the lockdown's starting to ease up a little bit.
Oh, 100%. I mean, we were a bit nervous launching in the middle of a pandemic, but we wanted to keep to our timescales. And the last week or so, we've really seen quite a lot of movement. Everyone's sort of looking to move properties, and I think everyone wants a garden now and bright spaces. So
Definitely.
Yeah, it's been a positive couple of weeks, and it's starting to move correctly or properly.
No, I totally agree. As we were just talking with each other just beforehand, I was out myself doing inventories this morning. I'm still hands-on, so it's great because that way then I know what the market's doing, I know what properties are looking like, and I can get a really good feel as to how things are progressing. We're certainly seeing the numbers starting to come in job-wise, not to the same kind of level we would normally get this time of year. That's not going to happen, but we are starting to see movement, which is really, really good.
Positive trends.
Yeah. So we just launched during the pandemic. Explain to the listeners what Ome's about. Who are you? What does Ome mean?
Yeah, so I'll start with the Ome meaning. We're essentially, we want to be a comfortable lifestyle brand as much as it's a rental brand. So very often you'll have a conversation, it's I'm going home. It's not a going home, Queen's English. It's very, I mean, that's the story we give ourselves. We like the word, to be honest.
I was wondering. It's slightly different, and I couldn't draw a parallel with anything. I wasn't quite sure. Now I'm it makes sense.
I mean, the closest description we did find was, I think it's unripe plum in Japanese, which I don't think really has any real meaning to our market, but so we've stuck with the definition we've got for ourselves. But so we are, for want of a nutshell description, a deposit replacement. So we're essentially looking at the market, thinking that the upfront cost of moving it can be not just problematic, but it can also sort of have longer term impacts on tenants who maybe could benefit from a bit of cash flow. Particularly when you look at the last couple of months and how an extra £500-1,000 could really help people.
Definitely.
So about a year ago, we started looking at the market. I'll touch upon my sort of Hamilton Fraser background and sort of hat on in a second, but we weren't 100% sure with how the current crop of deposit replacements ticked all the right boxes for tenants, but also, as I say, on the Hamilton Fraser side of things, running my deposits and being a government authorised scheme, a lot of the transparency issues and things like that. And it's not to say that those products aren't suitable at all. We just thought that there was more that we could change. So we came at it from an approach of sort of small payments up front. The traditional deposit replacements looked at that 1 week upfront payment to replace the deposit. We wanted to try and get it as close to 1 day's rent value. So what we've looked at and what we're launching with is a monthly subscription for tenants who would rather have a choice to not rent with a deposit. So whether that be a £5, £10, £15 membership, they pay that over the course of the tenancy, and then at the end, as you'll be aware in the inventory world, if there's any damages or the condition isn't quite the same, then they just pay for those fixes or outstanding bills, or whatever the case may be. So it's really just trying to build upon current deposit practice, but with tenants and landlords so used to custodial deposits now where they're not even holding the money, it made sense to potentially just remove that aspect of the product altogether and have tenants be able to move in a little bit more comfortably.
Yeah, because there's a lot of money to be held in the deposit schemes that literally just don't do anything. And certainly when I talk to tenants, in the main, they do treat the properties well. They do look after them. They do want their deposits back. But it's such a huge amount to come up with initially before you move, and also it's that move between properties, and
it's not just the one deposit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're seeing people move from maybe bigger houses down to smaller ones because of cash flow, because of the impact of where we are with COVID-19, etc. But also the fact is that they're changing maybe because of jobs. Again, that's quite a transient market at the moment, or just because they want to change of scenery. But to be able to then port that amount of money, that big amount, between properties, is really, really difficult. So I can definitely see where the benefit is.
Yeah, well, we did a bit of research with the My Deposits database we had, and the last 12 months has seen about the average deposit being around £1,300 or £1,299 or something like that. So you've got that upfront payment, but then you've got another £1,299 stuck in between. So it's actually £2,500 you're talking about, if not more, just to move property, and that's without the first month's payment up front and any moving costs you've got and furniture being shifted or buying new furniture. So it's really just down to that cash flow. We were never about don't pay your deposit and go on holiday, or buy a brand new sofa here, or that's just not really the atmosphere or the practices that we want people to be looking at. It's not about stretching yourself, it's just about managing the money in your way, and ultimately it's just down to a choice, not just for the tenants at the end of the day, it's also down to the landlords or agents. Do I want to be managing a deposit, someone else's money, when I've got to pay for client money protection? Do I want to worry about missing that 30-day payment, 30-day protection period by one day?
Especially fines involved with that as well.
Oh, exactly. I was speaking to a letting agent just the other week, and she was saying that they learnt the hard way how to make sure everything's in order. She was she registered the deposit, she gave the documents, she did everything she needed to do, but missed that payment, actually paying it into the scheme by one day.
Wow.
And despite showing the judge that she'd done everything she needed, or the branch had done everything that they needed to do, they still issued the maximum three times deposit fine. So it also, the deposits they are great, don't get me wrong. It's probably the best way of managing trust between two parties, but the finances involved and the onerous angles to it can suddenly start to make it a little bit complex. So we just wanted to take out that complexity and offer choice to everyone in the market in what we would regard as the right way.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that. And as someone who's both been a landlord and is actually currently a tenant,
Nice.
I'll own up to that. I am a tenant through choice, and that's absolutely fine. Me having to stump up the amount of money that I need to do for the deposit, and then having to know that money's going to be there. And yes, I can understand it, landlord point of view, they want to make sure they look after the property, etc. And I'm probably, in a way, because of what I do, even more careful about the property than
100%.
maybe everybody would. Not saying that they're not, but it's just because I'm more aware.
You know all angles.
Yeah, I do. So I can certainly understand, certainly from a landlord point of view, why it's so important. But it's nice to have the choice, definitely. Yeah. But, and I know we've talked about this before, but with that choice, obviously comes responsibility. We still, as tenants, have a responsibility, look after the property, give it back in a reasonable condition, i.e., taking into account fair wear and tear, no great big gaping holes and damage and so on and so forth, giving it back clean. And basically, I always say to tenants when I'm doing checkouts with them or I'm talking to landlords, getting the property back as you would like to find it. That's
100%.
Isn't it simple?
It's like anything in life, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it's how you would like to receive something back, or how you'd like to receive it in the first
100%.
place. I don't think that's unreasonable, and I perfectly understand that. And I think certainly where inventories come into it, that by being able to showcase that at the very beginning, at the point of check-in, is really helpful also, not just the landlord to say, okay, this is my property, this is what I expect back, but also for the tenant to say, okay, well, now you've got a marker and now you've got something to refer back to, so that when you're getting the property ready and you're about to leave, you can go back to the report and then have a look at it and say, okay, well, I need to make sure that's done, I need to fix this or repaint that, or, you know, just so that you know that you are going to get that that deposit amount back. But also, it's not always, I find, just about the money, it's the pride. I deal with a lot of tenants, and in the main, they're very proud of how they looked after the property. They're very keen that the landlord knows that they looked after the property, and that that they try and give it back in its best possible form. One, to get the money, but two, because it makes them feel good. It makes them feel like, you know, this is how I would like someone to treat me if I was, you know, I was a landlord. So
yeah, 100%.
There's a lot to be said about that.
I think one of the key things, and this is one of our core values of the of Ome, but also wider of Hamilton Fraser, is that transparency is absolutely vital. We really wanted to, especially with Ome being the newest product on the line, we really wanted to make sure that transparency was core, that we used objective language, and it wasn't a case of, as you say, winning and losing. That's where pride and ego gets in. It's not a case of saying, I've got £1,000, I don't want to give you back that £1,000 because it's mine, sort of thing. It was just a case of, well, as you say, and that's, and I'm sure we're going to touch upon it, but that's why we wanted to make check-in inventories and reports mandatory in our product. The reality is that everyone knows that we should be doing those things, but we wanted that to be mandatory because the best way of avoiding the need for resolution at the end is by making sure that everything is done right at the beginning.
Yes, and I totally agree. And yeah, definitely was going to ask you that as almost like the next question, because it seems to be at the moment, yes, everyone knows that they're a good idea. It makes sense. You need evidence in order to be able to effectively go to a dispute, potentially go to a court, or even just between two parties, you know, having a conversation. You need 100%. Something to use as a basis to say, this is how it was, this is how it is now, these are the changes, and what do we need to do about them? But again, I don't find that other deposit schemes really seem to be really pushing like you are to make them mandatory, to make them part and parcel of your effectively evidence bundle. So, because you think about it, you're going through the whole tenancy, you're starting up an AST, you're doing the reference checks, you're taking deposits, potentially, you are making sure that that person is someone fit and proper to both be living in the house, same as you do for a landlord, making sure that they're fit and proper to be a landlord as well. And then you go through all that process, and some people will have an inventory and some people won't, because as we know, it's not a legal requirement. Funny enough, in South Africa it is, but here it's not. But like you said, there is a bit of an expectation that you should have that, because how do you evidence? But the fact that it's not a requirement always says to me, well, why not? Because it's the one document that potentially could make or break a dispute in regards to either the landlord's favour or the tenant's favour, in as much as it, you know, showcasing what's happened with the property. But it's never looked at that way, and I never understand that. So why is it that you're going down that route? Why are you wanting it to be mandatory?
Well, I think one of the things is that we can, if that makes sense, because with the traditional cash deposit protection schemes, they are very much prescribed their rules and regulations by the government. So they've got to be catch-all and allow all disputes to come in and that sort of thing. So we can play around a little bit because it's not a sort of a prescribed approach from the government. But more so because, and it's definitely not the be all and end all with an inventory, because there is going to be a lot of other things that come into a dispute at the end of the day. It's not the golden bullet, but it's definitely a really key part of the arsenal of a landlord or agent, and indeed the tenant actually going into a resolution at the end of the process. But the reason why is because when you look at, say, My Deposits, and it'll be the same for all deposit schemes, when you've got that document at the beginning of the process, as you say, it can be the make or break piece of the jigsaw at the end of the day. It can be the bit that says to the adjudicator, this is the condition of the property, alongside the AST to say what the responsibilities were. This is how we expected it to come out, or at the very least, near as possible, with fair wear and tear and all those different bits. And I think from our perspective, and I mentioned it a second ago, resolutions, disputes, whatever you want to call them, they're won or lost in the first part of the tenancy, in my opinion, because you've got to show that condition. And at uni, I studied law, and at the end of the day, adjudications are just an alternative to court. And when you study law, you get told that you've got to look at all the evidence, you've got to look at what was expected and what actually happened. And at the end of the day, if you didn't do what was expected of you, did it cause someone else's loss? And without the inventory, without the check-in reports, I think it's very hard. Yeah. And at the very least, I think if you compare it to other aspects of life, so renting a car or buying a new car, actually, for that matter, I've recently purchased a new car and I couldn't pick it up because it was on the first day of lockdown. So I've had to wait 2 months. It's been sitting there in the forecourt, and when we got there, I just wanted to make sure that everything was okay, because actually, am I picking up what I expected I was picking up? And as it's on a finance agreement, in 3 years' time when I take it back and potentially upgrade, I'm showing them, again, is what I'm giving you back what you expected to see. So you do it with other aspects of your life, and I think so often renting in particular can be forgotten about with those sort of extra little checks, because you see it as a home. Yes. You don't treat it in the same sort of way because I'm moving into my dream home, or I'm moving into a new flat to go and work close to work, or live closer to work, whatever the case may be. There's other emotions there. Mm-hmm. It's not purely financial. So I think there is a case to be said that, and this is why we're going this direction, mandatory inventories just open up the transparency early on and start that process from the beginning.
I think that makes perfect sense. And again, if I put my landlord hat on and if I put my tenant hat on, it all makes absolute perfect sense. And to me, it ties in the whole of the evidence bundle, because then there's no gap, so it's very clear. And like you said, if you do end up with a dispute, then like you said, you've already got all the information you need. It's then about that mediation, isn't it? It's then about 100%. Saying, okay, what can we do about the situation? How can we potentially come to an agreement that everybody's happy with? And if it's based on fact, and not subjective evidence, because it's clear, it's in front of you, it's written, it's dated, it's pictured or video, depends on how it's done. It makes all the difference, because then it's not really in dispute because it's there, it's tangible. Yeah. Whereas if you or I would just kind of say, well, the property was a really good order, and you'll go, great, lovely, but how do you know, and how do I know? How can I see that? If you haven't got a report, you don't have that.
No, 100%. And I think a lot of it also comes down to that emotion, as we were mentioning just a second ago, because the vast reality is that the majority of landlords aren't doing this as their day-to-day career. It's an inherited property or a pension or another opportunity to sort of improve their own wealth. And I think sometimes there is that emotional element from a landlord as well. So being able to set the stalls out and identify a valuable object or a brand new carpet, or it's the same reason why you get a receipt at the end for works to put things back. It's about that value, that objective value. A chair to me could be worth £1,000, but actually in reality I can go to IKEA because it was a £15 chair. It's about the objective value at the end of the day. And I think sometimes a document that sets the stall out and sort of evens up the playing field, let's say, is not just beneficial for a landlord, but equally it is that transparency that the tenant knows what to expect in the tenancy. And sometimes that's almost the most important bit, actually. You're setting the expectations early for everyone.
Very much so. And that's something I definitely have a conversation with tenants when we do check-ins. We say exactly that. And I always say when I'm working with clerks and training them is, take the emotion out of it. It's what you can see, what's there, where it is, to what extent it exists, and then you evidence that. And then that means then it's all factual. Whereas as a landlord, when I had my own property, it's my property. So of course then I've got an emotional attachment to it. I it's a family home, and therefore I think about it differently. Whereas an inventory clerk will just look at it as a property. So, does it have walls? Has it got doors? Are there damage? Yeah. Can I showcase this? And not opinion. It's all based on factual evidence. I mean, I know we can go from subjective to objective depending on the pictures you've got, but it's knowing how to do that and then looking at it quite dispassionately. I've walked around properties with landlords before, kind of, dictating the room and the property, and the landlords had to leave because I'm pointing out all the faults, and they're like, "Oh my God, this is my pride and joy." It's absolutely brilliant, and it does look absolutely brilliant, but it does have flaws. Every property does, no matter whether it's new or old. But it's not a case of us doing that because we've just been downright awkward on trying to make a point. We're doing it because if we can see it, then the tenant can see it. Therefore, the tenant has to see it to be able to understand it, to be able to then look after the property and then give it back, because without that, they're not going to know.
Exactly, and sort of the point of an adjudication as well, going back to sort of it as a replacement for court, it's essentially the awards that an adjudicator give out. I'm not a qualified lawyer, so I might be slightly wrong in my terminology, but it's essentially damages that you're issuing out. It's not a sort of a claim. It's not an insurance sort of new for old. It's essentially saying to the landlord or the tenant, whichever way around it ends up being, had the contract been fulfilled, i.e. you looked after the property, or you didn't do this or you didn't do that, whatever the case may be, where would that landlord be financially, and would they have had to replace that chair, or would they have had to fix that window, and those sorts of things. And that's kind of the point. You would never go to court without all your evidence and your house in order. You would only go to court with the evidence, and you'd only go and use a court if you think you could win at the end of the day. And I think that's the point. Although I shouldn't say win, actually, because that's also, again, but going back to the ego and the terminology, I guess. But the point being is that you would only ever go with evidence that would help your case, I guess.
And I don't think anybody really wants to go to court. I don't think anybody really wants to go to dispute, but sometimes it has to be done. Because maybe one party doesn't agree with the other. It's not necessarily fault per se. It's about just the agreement just not there. But I think you're right. If you've got all the information, then it helps that process, and it potentially gets you to the point where you can get agreement, because it's very difficult to dispute the facts if they're physically in front of you, i.e. the report, pictures.
100%.
If it's done correctly. With that in mind, and looking at doing, and having mandatory reports, one thing that does irk me, and I know we've spoken about this before previously, is the fact that we're completing the reports, we're providing them as part of the dispute process, often through the agent or for the landlord, but the feedback, the working with the inventory clerks doesn't really tend to happen with any deposits. Do you, as Ome, have any kind of thoughts about whether that is something that you want to do, you should be doing, or you're going to be working to? Because I certainly think focus groups would be very beneficial, because clerks are doing it on their side. We know what works, we know why we're putting it in and what's required, but what we don't know is from the dispute services what you need from us. Because we see case studies, but they're never specific. And I can honestly say, in the thousands, and I can say this, thousands of reports I've personally done, feedback has been zero.
Well, this is the thing. And I think for me, I see an inventory report a bit like a reference for a tenant. So if we take Ome, for example, we ask that there's a minimum referencing criteria of a tenant, because, again, it's that risk element. It's, is this tenant, and going back to affordability, it's not an affordability issue, it's cash flow. If the tenant passes the reference, we know that they can afford the property. Therefore, it's just about choice of managing money. And the same with an inventory. We ask for it to be done, and we do ask for the evidence of the resolution point of things. But at the moment, there's no way of validating that these things have been done, or no easy way of validating things that, unless we did it ourselves at the end of the day. And that's just not where our expertise lies. So thinking about what we're doing at Hamilton Fraser at the moment. So I'm on there as well as pushing Ome, part of Hamilton Fraser's business transformation and innovation team. And about a year ago, there was 2 of us. Now there's 15 of us. And we're constantly looking at how we can validate the information that we're given. And a lot of the time, particularly with the guys that work on the data sides, it's about standardization. It's incredibly hard in any walk of life, especially for data guys, to trend analysis and compare and contrast if things don't equal the same. So amongst the whole Hamilton Fraser group, we're trying to create a standardized resolution process for the property redress scheme, for my deposits, for Ome, that can help standardize that process. The same goes along with referencing. Can we validate that a reference has taken place, or could we do a really light touch reference ourselves to make sure that that data is standardized? And it goes to the same as for check-in, check-out reports and inventories. Is there a standardized approach that we can ask for without inhibiting the market, because everyone does it themselves a slightly different way? Or is it a case of hoping that a standardized approach comes out? I don't know whether hope is the right phrase, but
no, I think hope is the right phrase.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of discussion about standardisation, but I don't see much movement. I mean, I know from my point of view, it's something I'm working towards, and I'm trying to get the market to be. Even if we had like a framework, even we had a kind of like a go-to, this is the kind of information we want to see, and not necessarily format, because format is very different to the individual, to the provider, etc. But certainly have it so that you have certain sections and subsections that you want to see, that you as the company or the dispute service that would deal with this dispute, should it go forward, would have and need to be able to make a decision. So what does that look like? You know, do you need your health and safety section in there with your smoke and alarms in there? Do you need a section in there in regards to things like blinds? You know, has the right kind of blinds been put in? Do they conform to the right standards? Has things like Legionnaire risk assessment or fitness for human habitation been done? Because that then kind of helps towards that evidence of whether the property is fit and proper to be, first of all, rented. Then if it is rented, then you've got the inventory, say, well, this is the condition, this is how it looked, and then what it looks like at the end, and you've got that complete timeline of the actual tenancy. But for me, certainly as a provider, if I knew what the deposits services needed from our reports in regards to even just like the general information, you know, I need the smoke alarms, I need certificates, I need the rooms broken down into A, B and C components, then we would have a way of understanding, well, this is how we then need to format our report. So we would create that framework so we could then come back to you with that report, and then you'd be able to use it better. But also I think it would be very useful to have better feedback, not so much in case studies, because, you know, unless they're specific to you, you can learn a lot, but I want to know if I submit a report and it either wins or say not wins, out of it, I'm learning. If it helps the adjudicator to do their job and get to the end result and come to an agreement, then I then know, same as any kind of learning opportunity, I know then, okay, I need to do this next time and that works, or no, I need to change my working stance because it didn't work. But we don't have that opportunity, and it doesn't seem to be afforded to inventory clerks.
I think what you say earlier about frameworks is actually is probably the best way of describing it, because you could argue the same sort of arguments with contracts and tenancy agreements.
Yes.
Everyone's going to have their own approach because everyone's been burnt in one way or they've succeeded in another way, and they've adjusted their tenancy agreement as a result. But the government provide a guidance tenancy agreement, and it brings in the experiences of the various different groups that it needs to, and sort of builds it in that way. And occasionally things will be missed, and occasionally things will be added, like we've seen with the pets recently and things like that. So I think there is definitely space there, I think, to say, look, this is the general idea of what we're expecting from an inventory. In terms of prescribing things, I think that would be difficult, because going back to sort of what the market phrases as accidental landlords, but the guys or the girls out there that don't really see themselves as landlords, that's really the important part of the market that prescription and frameworks work to. Because if you don't regard yourself as a landlord, it's incredibly hard to go and find the information, because you just don't know what you don't know. And I think that's where education is important. And I know that my deposits and the other two deposit schemes since 2007, since they've been running, that's the tricky bit. How do you find the landlords that don't know their landlords? And then you've got to tell them the law, and then you've got to tell them best practice. And it's always exactly the same sort of principles at the end of the day. Can we professionalize our industry? And I think standardization and frameworks definitely does professionalize the industry and raise standards. And one of the things that we're really trying to do with Ome, we're not just a deposit replacement scheme in our mind. We're much more, and will be much more. And one of the things is, can we take those inventory reports directly from the inventory providers, for example?
Yeah.
And in order to do that, we're going to need to standardize our approach, because we're going to need to do some degree of integration or upload, whatever it may be. So there's going to have to be some degree of standardization. So you'd imagine that if we can come up with that in the future and think about how we do those sorts of processes, then it's only 1, 2, 3 steps removed from there to start becoming, as an industry, a bit more standardized. So I definitely think it's a really, really, really positive aspect of the market. But your guess is as good as mine as to how and when. And maybe actually your guess is far more valuable than mine, actually, because you're in the world of inventories and how that would work, I guess. So to be honest, feedback from inventory clerks such as yourself and providers for Ome in particular is really, on a personal level, really helpful. But as a market, I think it's a case of education and sort of evangelization, if that makes sense. Yeah. What does a really good inventory do for you as a landlord, do for you as a tenant or an agent, I guess?
Yeah, it's the document. Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree. I mean, I think framework is definitely the way to go. Not necessarily like pre-described, but certainly a better understanding of what it should contain or could contain, and also the reasons why. Because
yes, the benefits.
Often when I'm training people, we'll discuss as to why certain items are described and how they're described, etc. And often the question goes, why are you doing that? And there's got to be a reason for it. You can't just do it. It's pointless, wasting everybody's time, and it doesn't help. But if you explain it and it has an end result, it helps or it helps build that understanding, that information, that learning. Then it's all valuable. I think certainly from my personal point of view, to be involved in that side of thing would be very, very useful. And I think certainly Ome and deposit services as a whole could really do much better if they involved, the industry much more, talk to us, because we're out there doing.
I agree.
And I used to do it when I was working with the prison service years and years ago, and we would do case studies on probation reports and case studies on certain aspects of those. And by doing that, by having focus groups, by feeding back individual kind of understanding and approaches, it helped us actually formulate where we then needed to go for the next steps to make the service better, make it easier to understand and easier to implement. And it's exactly the same premise.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, my colleague Nick, he's our co-founder, and he'd hate me for saying this, but he's a real sort of stickler for say good design and purpose. And one of the things that we constantly ask ourselves when we're, say, designing a process for Ome is what's the purpose of this button? What's the purpose for that? To text or whatever the case may be. If it doesn't have a purpose, get rid of it. And when it comes to, as you say, frameworks for inventories or frameworks for anything, quite frankly, what's the purpose of why we're asking that? So when we're asking a question for a tenant to sign up, is that question actually going to help them? If not, get rid of it. And it comes to the inventory. Is taking that photo, or is it having that format, or whatever the case may be, is it doing that way going to help the end result? And if not, get rid of it. But if it is, standardize it, or if it is, enshrine it in that process. And I think from my perspective, that approach is something that we're really trying to push into everything we do at the moment. So asking for check-in reports, why do we do it? Or because we know with my deposits that, quite frankly, most of the time there's an inventory, it's a lot easier. So it's a lot easier from our perspective, and obviously time at the end of the day equals money and it equals resource. But from a landlord and from an agent and from a tenant's perspective, that evidence at the end of the day just creates a fairer, more positive outcome. So that's why we go from that purpose perspective, I guess.
I totally agree with that. It builds that understanding, and it also creates best practice as well. And like you're saying, if you think about it, every single thing that we have or we do all has some kind of framework or process behind it. Be it electrical, be it something we eat. There's a process. There's a pattern. There's a pattern for your sweater or if you're eating something at a restaurant, there's often a menu and there's something to understand, so you get to the point where you make a decision and you do something about it. So it's all part and parcel. I know slightly off track, as it were, but it's exactly the same. It's all
I get you, yeah.
as frameworks. So I just think, certainly from our point of view, it's great to see Ome championing the use of inventories. I know the industry uses them, but I think, you know, we could do so much more, and the wealth of knowledge, the best practice that is out there just isn't capitalised enough on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it really, really could be. And if we get to that point where we've got standardisation, then it makes your life easier, it makes the landlord's life easier, the agents, and equally the tenants, because at the end of the day, it's their money, whether they do it either upfront in a great big amount,
or at the end,
monthly, or at the end. Exactly, their money. So if we can do it so it's fair and easy for them to understand it, but it still showcases all the information, it's got to be a really good thing.
Oh, 100%. So and it's a great thing that we're having this conversation, because quite frankly, 10 years ago, and so I took my first phone call at My Deposits when I was 15, and Christ, that was scary, because no one knew. No, I'm now 25, so I like to think I've got an old head on young shoulders. But when I took that phone call, we were still learning what. And I was only doing it for a summer, but we were still learning what to expect from the phone calls. And then, like, you talk to the adjudicators who were there then and are still there now, and again, they didn't know what they were looking at the time, because they would get contracts on the back of a napkin, and they would get envelopes where someone's just picked up something and written down what's in the property. If you look at what's now coming through, it's incredible how 10 years has made such a difference. And you look at then in the next 5-10 years, and particularly with the pandemic we're in, and sort of the speeding up of technology and things like that, you do wonder, actually, what's the conversation we're going to have in 10 years' time? Again, are we going to be talking about standardization? Hopefully, probably not. We're probably talking about the next thing. Is it, I don't know, a big database of inventories, and who knows what we're talking about? But there's always those milestones, and I think at the moment the milestone for inventories is knowing what to expect, knowing what to do, and as a consumer, a tenant or a landlord or an agent, why I am doing it, as in why is it beneficial, what will I gain out of it? Because I imagine probably one of the things that you get challenged is, or I know that my tenant will look after them, I've referenced them, why will I need to bother with an inventory, that sort of thing. So I guess, again, education and evangelization, what actually is the benefit of an inventory? Why am I doing all these extra processes? And then over time, that will start to filter down into the, as we say, sort of almost the hobbyists. I think you mentioned it earlier, the landlords that don't see themselves as landlords.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had loads of those kind of conversations. You know, why am I going to such detail? You know, why does it need to be? The property's fine. It's, you know, don't look after it. It'd be okay. It's like, well, yeah, but what happens if it's not okay? And what happens if we don't give you that bit of information and we haven't done it properly? And then come the end, it all goes a bit wrong. And then you're looking to us, he goes, well, you know, we don't have the information there for you because you didn't want it, and now you do. But the trouble is, then it's going to go, yeah, but that's great, but I haven't got any parallel to draw it from. I've got no starting point. You know, there's no inventory. So yeah, I've had loads of conversations like that. But I think sometimes it's because it's not until you actually go through that process, or in some respects you've had your fingers burnt. You don't really understand it. I think in the main everybody does. But I do think, like I said, the framework needs to be there. I think there certainly needs to be a little bit more conversation being had, certainly with, you know, we're doing it, so we know how things work and what they should do. And if you're then telling us, well, this is also what I want to be able to adjudicate to make it better, make it fairer, we can meet in the middle. And then
100%.
we've got the tools to be able to get all that done and done properly.
No, I 100% agree. 100% agree.
So what's next for Ome? Is anything else coming up on the horizon?
So we've just launched our tenant helpline.
Yes, I saw that. That's amazing.
Thank you. That was very much down the line from our perspective, but we had the frameworks in place. Frameworks, talking about the same terminology. We had the all the plans in place for this, and when COVID did take a bit of a hit on the tenant lifestyle and questions such as furlough and even bereavement, we thought that bringing this helpline would really help. We cover sort of legal and debt advice, but even down to sort of physical and mental health advice and counselling and things like that. So we thought it's actually quite a simple thing for us to bring forward in terms of what we're planning. So we've chucked that straight in. Any tenant that downloads the app, regardless of whether they're using our membership or not, will be able to have access to that. That was sort of the least we could do, I guess.
Yeah.
the rest of the roadmap at the moment is very much feedback and sort of improving what we've got, but we really want to start looking at those broader lifestyle elements from a tenant's perspective. So is there a way, I mean, everyone knows about rent recognition and open banking and things like that, but can we put that in a place where that suddenly becomes a no-brainer? Can we help landlords with their referencing? Is there ways that we can automate some of the inventory processes, as you say, bringing it straight in from a provider? They're the things that are on our mind. Whether there's a solution out there, I don't know yet. But
I could talk to you about that. I've definitely got a solution.
That'd be great, yeah. And again, also talking about sort of the upstream. So My Deposits, Hamilton Fraser broadly, we're really good at that. We'll tip our hat and say we're really good at the downstream process, the end of tenancy, the adjudications. We've got our legal services with landlord action that do the really tricky confrontational aspects of end of tenancy. But upstream is quite fresh to us. We do have a tenancy referencing provider, but other than that, it's very small. So can we help with the creation of tenancy agreements and, as you say, inventories and anything like that? So we've got our eyes in two angles, I guess, downstream and upstream. But as in to what the next step is, we're really going to take that from the industry, really, the marketplace. And there is some requests that we've had from landlords. So it has been, do you have inventory providers or do you have rent guarantee providers? And that's the standard stuff. But are there things that we can start to look at the market and innovate on in a different sort of way? So honestly, I don't think there's an answer other than again, framework listening.
But when you think about it, again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier on, that everything is born out of a framework, isn't it? Because we need to know where we are now, where we need to go, and how we're going to get there effectively.
Exactly.
And I think certainly this current situation with the pandemic, innovation has really come to the fore. I mean, certainly from our point of view, from InventoryBase Academy and InventoryBase point of view, giving tenants the ability to do their own interim inspections, because obviously we don't want to go in their home, we don't want to put them at risk, we don't want to be put at risk. We want
exactly.
To be comfortable. So giving them the ability to be able to do a report that is based on the fitness of human habitation markers, to be able to upload it, put their comments on, give their pictures, etc., all in the comfort and safety of their home, but still then giving that understanding to the landlord, to the agent, that the property is okay, or something needs to be happening in regards to maintenance. We wouldn't have thought about that 6 months ago. We just wouldn't. And if you look at things like the viewing online now, we're using Zoom, we're doing video viewings, etc. Everyone's pivoting, everybody's innovating. So I think in a way, and we touched on this just before we started this podcast, is the fact that as much and as upsetting and as difficult this whole situation has been, there has been some positives out of it. We've come together as people, businesses, we're helping each other much more than we ever did before, and we're looking at things quite differently now. And one of the things that I've personally find heartening, and certainly from what you've just been saying about what you're looking to do in regards to looking upstream, is the help element. How can we help? How can we make it better? What can we do to make that whole transaction as easy as possible, so everybody feels supported, everybody feels on the same level playing field? It's not an us and them anymore.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Inventory Professional Podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, subscribe to our podcast now and share the love. This podcast was brought to you by InventoryBase, providers of industry-leading property inspection software, accredited training, and on-demand property reports.